It's necessary to dismantle structures that continue to oppress us, no matter what these structures or projects are. And Zionism is also, like I said, like if we situate it historically, it's also a project that is premised on white supremacy and racism and colonialism and like all of these different structures. And that's why Palestine is so important, because of what it means for people globally. Like if we dismantle the Zionist project, then we're also dismantling capitalism, because the Zionist project was essentially a project which wanted to find land that could be generative in order to produce capital, because it was valuable land. And in order to capture that land, we need to, the idea was to get rid of the people that live on top of it.
This is a moment where we're witnessing like the reunification of the student movement. This is a moment where actually students are coordinating on a national level about Palestine, and it hasn't happened in years. And we have like the more experience now over all these years, and we're going to be funneling that into strengthening the student movement. But also because as long as the genocide continues and as long as Palestine is not free, we won't rest, because it's our moral duty and responsibility, and that's the commitment we make. And that's what a lot of British students recognize, is that we have a responsibility and a duty to say, not in our name. The institutional complicity has to end, and the British government will eventually have to listen. And it's not because, you know, of the negotiations, it's not because of the conversation with the administration, it's because the power of the movement as a whole is going to also strengthen the student movement, and the student movement also leads the way towards that.
So hello and welcome back to Palestine Deep Dive. Today I'm thrilled to be interviewing two amazing Palestinian voices, powerful voices, here in the UK, Yara and Yasmin from Palestinian Youth Movement. Today we're going to talk about the UK encampment, the student activities and work in the UK. We're going to talk about the history of student protests and the events in Gaza. First, let me start by asking you about the news that we heard this morning from Rafah. Today, the Israeli tanks and army invaded Rafah after 7 months of this genocide. And it came actually after Hamas after Hamas agreed to the deal that was proposed by Egypt and by Qatar. And yesterday, when I heard the news that Hamas agreed to this deal, we saw some footage coming from Gaza. The Palestinians were rejoicing, they were happy, they were protesting. They were a very, very, very happy and festive environment in Gaza. Everyone thought that finally ceasefire will happen in Gaza. Finally, the circle of genocide and death and destruction and suffering will end. But then the other day, we woke to the news that the Israeli army invaded Rafah. And the first thing they did is that they went to the border, to the Rafah crossing. And they were destroying the Rafah crossing, tearing down the Palestinian flags and putting the Israeli flags. We heard some news that many Palestinians were killed at the Rafah border. And that brought us back to the same circle of suffering, of a trauma that the Palestinians have been enduring for the past 7 months. It's actually not the past 7 months. It's been ongoing for the past 75 years. So tell me how you felt today after hearing the news of this invasion in Rafah.
So actually, we kind of knew from last night. We saw like the bombing intensifying last night, and the announcement from the Israeli War Cabinet that they were going to continue with the invasion of Rafah, despite the fact that the resistance had accepted the terms of the negotiations and accepted the terms of the ceasefire. And we know that the reason why, and we know that the demands of the resistance have always been about like the release of political prisoners, the complete withdrawal from Gaza, and the allowing the Palestinians who have been displaced unconditionally to return to their homes, to return to the rubble and to begin the difficult process of rebuilding life in Gaza. But it's also like as obviously as shocking and as brutal and violent and demoralizing the images are of like the tanks coming in and bulldozing around the Rafah crossing, this is the logical conclusion of, you know, how the genocide has unfolded over the last 7 months. And we know that also this whole process of the negotiations has been a complete sham, because the US and the CIA and all these parties that are supposed to be, you know, mediating this process have obviously been green lighting, and despite the public claims of, you know, the US government's rejection or like disapproval of the plan to invade Rafah, we know that they've been green lighting the genocide every step of the way. But this just proves once again that like what this genocide has been about since October 7th has been about destroying and decimating every aspect of life in Gaza and punishing Palestinian people for choosing to resist the occupation, for choosing to resist 17 years of siege, over 76, like we're a week away from the 76th commemoration of the Nakba, and over 100 years of brutal occupation. And so it's,
But Yara, the Israeli army is saying that they are invading Rafah now because they want to destroy the last 4 battalion of Hamas, of Al-Qassam brigades. But in fact, what we see is that every time they invade a city in Gaza, when they, for example, invaded Khan Yunis, they said they want to destroy Hamas. But what we have seen is that they destroyed the Palestinian infrastructure. They have entered the hospital. They have demolished hospitals, killed doctors, nurses, patients, people, civilians, women, and children. Now they're saying that they're entering Rafah. They're invading Rafah because they want to destroy Hamas. Do you believe that?
This is a tactic that the Zionists have used from the establishment of the Zionist entity, and it's a way to create a legitimate target in order to sustain the system of domination. And this is something actually why I really value studying, because it's actually something that I've managed to learn through a master's program that I'm doing this year. And it's there is a concept called useful violence, which is basically the concept of bombing daily infrastructure, bombing ambulances, mosques, schools, daily infrastructure, in order to create this image that Palestinians are a threat, and in order to kind of create the separation between civilians and the military or the resistance. So this is actually like a way to create a legitimate target and to kind of depict Palestinians as subhuman or infrahuman, to basically justify the daily bombing, no matter where it is, if it's children or not children or whoever it may be. But it's basically to create racialized subjects. That's how Israel sustains itself as.
That was actually very, very clear from the words and the comments of the Israeli officials. They said that no one in Gaza is innocent. Even the children in Gaza are not innocent. They say that the civilians in Gaza, they supported Hamas, they elected Hamas, and thus they deserve the suffering, the killing. And they also say that the children in Gaza are not innocent because one day they will grow up and they will fight Israel. How do you see that?
Yeah, I mean, also something that we have to also look at is the fact that like most of the people that are leading the resistance are actually orphans who've lost their parents as martyrs in previous assaults on Gaza. And like this is just a fact that we have to contend with, and that, I mean, it's also, we just have to trace back historically like how the resistance has been made up and who it's composed of, and it's composed of children of martyrs, and that's also just a cycle that repeats itself for as long as the Zionist project continues.
Yeah, and I guess also on the point around innocence, regardless of whether Palestinians choose to resist, they're going to be crushed by Zionism anyway. They're going to be crushed by the support of US imperialism, because because in and of themselves, like their political existence poses a threat to the Zionist project. It poses a threat to the idea that Zionism will never be satisfied unless it keeps on taking on more land. And so the idea of innocence in and of itself, and the fact that like everyone in Gaza has been a legitimate target to the Zionists for a very long time. And what we've seen in the last 7 months is the intensification of that logic in a way where like there is no, like it is it has never been clearer, like in any historical period since the beginning of the occupation of Palestinian land, that it is either that you are with the side of the occupier and the oppressor, or you are on the right side of history with the people who have been dispossessed and displaced for 100 years. And so, like, one of the things we always try to do in the Palestinian Youth Movement is like challenge this idea that, you know, we can only mourn particular martyrs in our community. We should be able to mourn the losses of our entire community.
Tell me more about Palestine Youth Movement.
So the Palestinian Youth Movement is a transnational grassroots base-building movement, and we're made up of Palestinian and Arab youth in exile as a result of the settler colonization of our homeland. So we actually see Zionism as a global phenomenon, and it's something that we need to confront from wherever we are. It's not just something that manifests like in Palestine, like on the ground. It's something that is a global project, and it's inherently linked to imperialism, and it's something that we actually need to confront and fight from wherever we are. And that's actually something that is like, it's super linked to the student movement, which is what we're going to talk about today, because we have a philosophy around the role of student movement and how students also need to be fighting and confronting Zionism where they are, which is on their universities, because universities are a site where imperialism is reproduced. Like, it's these institutions, especially in this country, but all over. I find it really difficult to say colonial legacies, because colonialism is very much maintained, and I can also talk a bit about that soon. But yeah, I think the way that we understand students as one of our fronts, which is like lenses through which we see our work, is basically that students have historically been at the forefront of social and political movements and have been kind of like the nucleus or the core to revolutionary change. And this is actually what we're seeing, like with the encampments all across the globe, like in over 142 encampments across the globe, is a testament to that.
We will come back to these protests, student protests, but let me take you back to a word that you just said. You said that Zionism is a global phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
For some people, Zionism means the Jewish right to self-determination.
Mm-hmm.
How do you view Zionism? What does Zionism mean to you as a Palestinian?
Zionism, to me, really needs to be situated in history, and we need to see Zionism as a continuation of two traditions. So Zionism was actually inspired by European nationalisms that were occurring at the time of when like Jewish movements in Europe were basically trying to think of like how to resolve the issue of anti-Semitism. And there were two solutions, essentially. One of them was to assimilate in the societies in which they were already living in. And the other one was a state building project, which was the establishment of Israel. So for me, that's exactly like how I understand Zionism. Like, it's a project that culminated from that specific history, and it's not something that like we can't really conceptualize. Like, we actually just need to look back at like how it was formed and deconstruct that in order to be able to understand it. So that's kind of like how it's a very new project. Like, it's not very old, which means that it's easier to understand how to dismantle it as well.
Why do you feel that you want to dismantle it? Is it necessary to dismantle Zionism?
I think it's necessary to dismantle structures that continue to oppress us, no matter what these structures or projects are. And Zionism is also, like I said, like if we situate it historically, it's also a project that is premised on white supremacy, and racism and colonialism, and like all of these different structures. And that's why Palestine is so important, because of what it means for people globally. Like, if we dismantle the Zionist project, then we're also dismantling capitalism, because the Zionist project was essentially a project which wanted to find land that could be generative in order to produce capital, because it was valuable land. And in order to capture that land, the idea was to get rid of the people that live on top of it. Okay, because of how valuable that land was and like the geopolitical interest in that land. So basically, going back to what I was saying earlier in the podcast was about how like Palestinian life has to be reduced And the way that Palestinian life is seen is as waste, because it's surplus, because it's extra, and we need to get rid of Palestinian life in order to take that land and use it for this project. So that's kind of the way that I understand the Zionist project, and like why it needs to be dismantled in order to actually get rid of all of these structures that continue to dominate a certain group of people.
Your family came from Rafah.
Yeah.
And Zionism, which Yara is talking about, deprives you from your right to live in your ancestral homeland in Rafah.
Yeah. Yeah. So my family is from a town called Malia in Rafah, which I believe now is like a bulldozed car park and theme park, or like a football stadium or something ridiculous like that sits on top of where my family used to live. But I guess also, I think for me, like dismantling Zionism and the right to return, and like the resolution to the misery of our people in the camps in like Lebanon and Syria and Jordan, all these places, also means like understanding that the Zionist project, the exile of our people, the exile of my family, also necessarily depends on the support of like the British government, the support of the US government. And like historically, Zionism has never been like an isolated movement. Like we obviously know like the historical importance of Lord Balfour and the Balfour Declaration. But beyond that, like the actual ideologies, the practical like infrastructure that made the Zionist project in Palestine possible was like absolutely dependent on the support of European colonial powers, and later the support of the US empire. And so the reason why I think like for the last 7 months the Palestinian cause has gripped so many people is because it is absolutely tied to the liberation of all people, because Zionism is like one element or like one manifestation of these like forces that are wreaking havoc across the globe, you know? And so when I think about like the dispossession of my family, when I think about my right to return, I also think about like the like life conditions in a lot of places in the world, including in this country, getting better actually when we see the dismantling of Zionism.
Some people would assume that calling for the right of return is illogical. It's unpractical. It's like you're asking too much. And you know, I'm also from Rafah, Al-Manshiyah.
Yeah.
And my mother came from Bir Saba. And every time we talk about the right of return or dismantling Zionism, people would think that we are crazy, we're too dreamy, and this is not going to happen, and this is not actually helpful to the Palestinians, and we should just settle in wherever we are in Gaza or the West Bank. How do you respond to that? Do you think it's actually logical to call for the right of return?
I think it's the only logical thing to call for, because
even after everything that's happening in Gaza?
Yeah, because what the right of return actually means is suspending completely the conditions that our people are living in. Because what we need to understand is that regardless of whether you're calling for the right of return, regardless of whether you're calling for the dismantling of Zionism, the Zionist entity is not going to rest until it completely until like all Palestinians are dispossessed from their land. And that's what we've seen over the last 30 years. You know, we know historically this choice of like giving up on the question of on the right of return was tried and tested, and we've seen how much that failed with the exponential expansion of settlements in the West Bank, with the brutal like containment of Gaza, in completely isolated. And so despite like how brutal the conditions, the violence that our people are facing, capitulating in the face of that is absolutely not an option. Because what has happened historically is that when there was capitulation, not only did we like lose so many more of our people as martyrs, not only did we lose so much more land, but we also lost political institutions that facilitated the organization of our society. It facilitated the our ability to like advance our struggle, because, you know, it's, what is that phrase that Ghassan Kanafani uses? It's like a conversation between the neck and the sword. There's no choice, you know, the empire will crush you anyway, as like Muhammad al-Kurd put it. So whenever like we get questions like these all the times, like this seems so far-fetched, this seems like something that is like not achievable. I think like also, even I would say even that's like an implication of like how the Palestinian movement is also organized in the West, because like the solidarity framework has been dominant, and one of the main interventions we make in the PYM is that Palestinians and Arabs in the West are not in solidarity with their siblings on the ground. You are part of this struggle. This struggle, your condition in exile in the West is a result of the colonial condition that is facing your people. You've been expelled, so you can't be in solidarity with your siblings on the ground. You're in the same struggle, you're on a different front line. And what we need to do is rebuild our institutions, rebuild our movement, so that we're able to lead, and we're able to lead in a way that like can ground the Palestinian movement as also a part of like the internationalist tradition in this country. The reason why the Palestinian movement is so like embedded, and you know, we see hundreds of thousands of people coming onto the streets, is because historically like, you know, or institutions like GUPS, like the General Union of the Palestinian Students, had a strong presence in London that built the foundations of that. And around that, you had Palestine Solidarity Campaign emerge way back in the day. You had these like solidarity organizations emerge, but our role is fundamental, and we need to rebuild that commitment, that discipline, that sacrifice to Palestine, because without it, there isn't going to be liberation. And that's what we learn actually from the people in Gaza.
You're talking about the liberation of Palestine.
Yes.
I want to ask you again about this question, because for us Palestinians, we are always talking about the liberation of Palestine as it is something that is certain, that will happen no matter what. What gives you hope that one day Palestine will be free?
That's a really good question. I think we have a responsibility as youth and as youth in exile to maintain a sense of revolutionary optimism. And I feel like where I've learned this sense of revolutionary optimism the most is through reading testimonies from our prisoners. And I feel like if our prisoners, who we view as like the compass of our struggle, we look to them to know the direction of our struggle, if they still, despite all of the conditions that they face as a result of their resistance to Zionism, if they are able to maintain that optimism that we will be free, I feel like it's our responsibility to uphold the line that our political prisoners hold. And I do believe that we will see liberation, especially now. Like, it's the prisoner struggle is central to what is happening right now. And I think that's actually something that's not really looked at a lot in the analysis that we're seeing, which is like really important for us to recenter and to refocus the struggle around. But that is why I believe that we will see a free Palestine, because of our prisoners, and we need to look to them, and that's what inspires me the most.
Why do you think Israel like put these Palestinians in prison the first time? Because in the West here, when we talk about Palestinian prisoners, they don't know that many of these prisoners are children. They don't know that hundreds or maybe thousands of these prisoners are put there in administrative detention without trial or without a charge. Tell me more about these prisoners.
I mean, historically, all projects that are centered around imperialism need to construct a certain type of person and to categorize people and classify them in order to control them. Like, it's a way of policing people, it's a way of managing and controlling people. And that's why prisoners are painted as terrorists. So like, I think I would reject anything, a lot of things, and a lot of the frameworks that we are we're taking from Western hegemony.
Yeah. Can I also say something about the prisoners? Yeah, I think so like, I guess also what we've seen in the last 7 months is like thousands, like the number of our prisoners has doubled, right? Like now there's around 9,400, I think was the most recent number that I saw. it probably is more. And we've seen like an intentional policy of like the occupation forces, when they enter an area, like mass detaining people, like humiliating, like genocidal conditions of imprisonment, like, and the testimonies we've heard from our elders, the children, everyone in society who's been detained are harrowing. But I think like there are two tactics maybe that we can think about, like in terms of imprisonment. First, we see like, you know, these mass detentions, and the way, and this is like, you know, the British Empire did it, the US Army did it in Vietnam, like this mass detention of people to isolate them completely from the rest of society, to like basically collective punishment, like mass detention as a way to punish the population for the acts of the resistance, is like a classic tactic that we see. But also what we've seen is that there's an intentional policy of like arresting the leaders of our movements, of our political movements, because the purpose of the Israeli prison is to completely destroy the capacity for our people to exist on a political level. And actually there's a quote that from Smotrich where he says, "I'm okay with Palestinians in Palestine as long as they exist as individuals, but not as like a political entity. As any people in the world, we have the right to organize ourselves politically. We have the right to liberate ourselves, but that can't coexist with a project like the Zionist project, because it is a genocidal project. It's foundationally a genocidal project, and it is inspired by genocidal projects of like European colonialism, and is supported now by the biggest like mass murdering force on the planet, which is the US empire. So actually the prisoners of our struggle, like they capture all of that in their struggle, because they're in the most intimate confrontation with Zionism day in, day out. And also they lead us in so many ways. Like they were united across factions, across geographies, before the rest of Palestinian society became as united as that, like in the last couple of years. And so they lead the way for us as well. And that's why they're so inspiring and they give us hope. Yeah, so I think it's also like, it's about decimating the political existence of our people.
I would love to talk more about this, but we'll have to move to the next to the next questions, because that's why we invited you to come. You came from SOAS encampment.
Yeah.
Now, so tell me about the environment there. When was it set up and why? And tell me more about the environment. How did you feel? And why did you do the encampment in SOAS?
So yeah, students at SOAS started the encampment yesterday in the morning. It launched, and SOAS students essentially started an encampment as part of an escalation tactic, because also I think there's a misconception that students in Britain haven't been doing anything in comparison to what students in the US are doing. But I think it's important to see it as a unified movement rather than trying to separate the actions of students here from what's happening in the US, because first of all, like, the encampment in Colombia actually took 2 months to organize. Like, it's not something that just sprouted out of nowhere. And the same thing, that's why we're seeing kind of like staggered encampments that are starting up, because it takes time, it takes organization, it takes structure to be able to sustain and deliver these encampments. And it's the same here. And students at SOAS have been organizing since before October. SOAS was actually where the first Palestine Society was set up in the whole of Britain, and as in the first university where it was set up. And SOAS has always been a hub for where Palestine organizing has happened, and there's been annual conferences for the community, for academics, for students, and that is something that's been facilitated by joints within the Palestinian community. And SOAS students have always kind of recognized this history and this heritage within SOAS. And also, like, I've kind of seen the shift of SOAS from being a super vibrant, politically active community with like a booming culture of resistance to the changing policies within SOAS and the way they govern. And it's kind of become increasingly neoliberal, and they're trying to confine students more and more. And in October, they actually suspended many students from the Palestine Society Committee and several alumni. I was one of them. And they they essentially wanted to eradicate Palestine organizing on campus. And it's not just Palestine organizing, also with the strikes. Like, they don't want students to picket outside the front steps anymore. They want to confine protests. They want students to feel like they can't do anything anymore. They want us to feel powerless. But the encampments are a testament to the fact that students are resisting these shackles, and they're going to continue organizing regardless of how much management attempt to stop them.
What are your demands?
The demands, that's a good question. So like I said, SOAS has been building a campaign for a while, and one of the demands is for SOAS to end their partnership with Haifa University, and they currently have a study abroad program with Haifa University to send their students who study modern Hebrew there. And Haifa University is a really horrific institution, as are all Zionist institutions, and they actually secured a tender to basically provide higher education courses to students there so that they could basically learn how to be better soldiers while ensuring that there's minimal disruption to their studies. So they can acquire a degree, but also learn how to basically police Palestinians better, how to carry out a genocide against Palestinians better. And it's essentially to basically skill them up so that they can develop research that can create weapons and use these against Palestinians. And like, that's why every Zionist institution is complicit, and that's something that students are now recognizing more and more, and that's why we're seeing actions like this against universities. So there's ending the partnership with Haifa University, calling on SOAS to divest from all of their investments in complicit companies, which is, last time I checked, was almost £5 million in complicit companies. It was £4.7 million when
What complicit companies?
So, for example, there's Albemarle Corps, which is like a chemicals company, which the Israeli military used to develop their weaponry. There's also Microsoft, and Microsoft have been involved in surveillance, like against Palestinians in the West Bank. And among many more, there's also Sony, Barclays, which has like subsidiaries in arms companies as well. So like, there's multiple different companies that are involved in either like the Zionist entity's illegal settlement economy or arms trade. And that is what students are seeking to disrupt.
These protests started from Columbia University, and then we saw that they spread all over the USA. Now we have, I think Warwick University is the first university that has a protest, an encampment, and now another university, Newcastle University, and now SOAS. How many universities joined these protests in the UK? How many encampments we have in the UK?
So we have 14 universities currently in encampment. 14, yeah. I'll try to list them.
Can you name some of them, please?
Yeah, I can list them.
Yeah, list them. Go for it.
Okay, I'll see if I can remember all of them. And growing, 14 and more.
Yeah,
more to come.
Yeah.
So at the moment, it's Sheffield, Newcastle, Manchester, Edinburgh, Aberdeen, Oxford, Cambridge, Leeds, UCL, SOAS. Goldsmiths have been occupying as well. Swansea, and that's quite a lot. Bristol. Yeah.
Yeah. And before Columbia started their encampment, there were I think 6 or 7 occupations as well. Mm-hmm. So Goldsmiths was in occupation for like almost 2 months. UCL held over a month occupation in like a big lecture theatre inside the university. Nottingham occupied, but they were removed like within within 2 days or something. Like, they were brutally repressed. And Leeds held a very long occupation. And there was another university, but I can't remember.
I have seen that many students who joined these encampments were protesting. They were not politically active, especially in Palestine issue. Why do you think these students joined these protests at this time?
I think a lot of students have been politically conscious, but I think the encampments are a vehicle to make them politically active, because especially at a university like SOAS, but also a lot of different universities, like, people are attracted to like the political nature of universities, or at least not universities, but like the student body. And students don't just go to study, they actually want to acquire a wider education and to understand the world better. And these encampments are a vehicle to do that, because that's why students are setting them up. They want to draw in and attract more students to actually understand the way that the university functions. So yeah, I don't know if they've been like inactive politically. I think they've been organizing for a while, but like also it just doesn't necessarily get as much coverage.
Why has it taken you so much to start these protests and encampments? We're talking about 7 months of genocide. Why now?
I think, well,
You go first.
yeah, I think that obviously like people were galvanized by what happened at Colombia, and that was like a model people wanted to replicate. But I think also a really important point is that, you know, the genocide has been going on for 7 months, and students have tried everything. They've tried to negotiate with their university administrations. They've submitted demands. They've held walkouts and rallies, national demonstrations at the Department of Education. They went to Downing Street. They did all of this, and the university administration is not listening. The UUK that brings together like the universities administrations, the universities UK, that body has also been targeted with demands from students. They're not listening. And meanwhile, the death toll is growing in Gaza. Like we have over 40,000 martyrs, which is a conservative estimate probably of the death toll. And students feel like this escalation is like a necessary step now because the university has not been responding to anything else. And so it's a way for students to demand that the university responds. But I guess like also on the flip side, students have been repressed really badly through different tactics, like through things like the prevent duty, through things like suspensions, through things like
and arrests.
Like students have been getting arrested since the beginning of the genocide, not just by normal police but also by counter-terror police. So like the nature of repression of the student movement in Britain is like maybe slightly different to the US. Like we know students have been getting suspended in the US as well, but the way that what they did is that basically every Palestine society on campus is registered with the student union. The student union has like the names of like the Palestine Society president. They have probably a list of names of people on the committee or in the society. And there have been instances where student unions gave that information to the police, or the university gave that information to the police, and then they would get arrested. And so we saw kind of like a preemptive policing, which is the exact logic of like counterterrorism laws. Like you preempt a violent act, when actually that what you're preempting is students being outraged at their university's complicity in a genocide. So,
and this is happening in the UK.
This is happening here.
Not the US.
No, this is happening here in the UK.
We haven't heard anything about this in the news.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
so why is the media ignoring you?
I think also some of it ignoring the demands.
Yeah.
I mean, universities also, there is a cycle when you're doing student organizing, and you're usually at university for 3 years. So they actually just usually wait for leadership, who usually are in their 3rd year of studies, to kind of leave university. And then there's kind of like a lack of institutional memory. So people who actually hold all of this knowledge and have been in the process of negotiations and understand the campaign demands leave university, and then there often isn't really a process of like handing that over to the next batch of students. So universities rely on this, and that's actually a gap that we need to fill, and that's part of our role as the PYM here. Like we see our role as also passing down that knowledge and bridging that gap, because universities rely on the fact that students forget because they just go through this cycle every 3 years.
And have you heard from the universities? Do they talk to you? Do
Yeah.
they hear you?
Yeah, and I actually think that they are sharing tactics because, for example, like UCL and SOAS have released very similar responses through their all student emails or all school-wide emails, which has basically said, like, the Gaza-Israeli conflict affects everyone. We understand that there's a range of emotions. You can have this protest, but keep it small and peaceful. And there's this tendency to contain and to make things small and to make it, just something that's like not non-threatening or non-violent. And like, yeah, they're definitely talking to each other and taking instruction from each other and from the government in order to ensure that there isn't something that they can't contain on campuses. But yeah, like they respond in a way that ensures that they look inclusive and neutral, which is obviously not the case because students have been submitting petitions and submitting testimonies to the way that they've been experiencing anti-Palestinian racism, Islamophobia, discrimination based on their political beliefs. So yeah, like there's been multiple responses from the university, but it's been in a way that serves their interests rather than the students.
In the US, the student protests have been accused that they are anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic, pro-Hamas, and all of that. Are you receiving the same comments from the university administration or the police or the students? Or in other words, are your protests threatening to the Jewish students here in the UK?
Absolutely not.
But this is what we hear in the media all the time. Like pro-Hamas protests, anti-Semitic protests, people who they're threatening to the Jewish students and all of that. So I need to hear from you.
Yeah. So actually the student movements here have been getting these comments, and these have been the tools of silencing like any pro-Palestinian organizing on campus for years now. And so actually the student movement had like the way that the student movement gets repressed here has maybe even like evolved past these like just accusations. Like what we're seeing happen is that actually, like for example, students who issued statements on October 8th, like after the bombing started, like, you know, what became very clear that it was going to launch a genocidal project. Students obviously released statements, you know, condemning this, and the way that many students were actually suspended for the contents of their statements, because saying things like we condemn, like, you know, the genocidal onslaught that is like launching in Gaza was perceived to be like anti-Semitic, and so students were getting arrested for statements like this. And so what we're seeing is that actually these arguments and this narrative is like institutionalized in such a way in the UK that people, like, it goes beyond just like, you know, like the university administration accusing the students of that. The university administration is like actively collaborating with the police to like arrest students based on these like false premises. So, and when you actually go into these spaces, you actually see that these spaces have been like probably the only like comfortable and safe spaces for Palestinian students, or for students who are obviously like very affected by the genocide that they're watching on their phones, because it's the only like space in the university where like it's not like crazy, and you're not accused of, you know, supporting Hamas, and you're not accused of like these things just for being like affected by it. But even like the way that like the tactics of repression on British campuses as well is that like you target a few individual students, you make an example out of these students, and you scare the rest of the student body. And like for years we had a really vibrant like Palestinian student movement in the country, like especially before the pandemic, and the way that the student movement was repressed was through these tactics of like there are specific Zionist organizations like UK Lawyers for Israel, Stand With Us. We can get into the Union of Jewish Students, but these organizations like have like very clear tactics that we almost immediately recognize when someone is being like suspended, or when the university investigation begins to like target a particular student, which we can also get into.
Did this happen to any of the students in the UK already?
Yeah, this has been happening to students for years in the UK. So for example, pretty much like everyone we know has experienced either an allegation, accusation, or investigation based on anti-Semitism. And we know that actually what we obviously know that these accusations are obviously tailored in a way to silence student organizing, and it's usually the exact same thing. And so usually you get like this document that like pulls a bunch of tweets, or pulls different excerpts from like a statement or an email that a student officer in a student union, for example, would have sent out, or like a member of the Palestine Society will have tweeted from their personal Twitter account, and they'll pull these quotes together and they'll accuse the student of being anti-Semitic, and therefore they need to be investigated. And quite often the student be suspended or will put on a leave of absence, and obviously that affects your personal education journey, but also it's intended to isolate you from the rest of the group. Whereas what we've seen in the US, like before the Columbia encampments, they suspended the entire SJP, like as an entire society, right? And so they're slightly different tactics of repression. And I would say that there's something about the British university's way of like targeting student organizing that is like more pernicious. And historically, like if we wanted to get into the history of the student movement in this country, that that's always been the intention and the strategy. So maybe we can talk about like what happened with Malia, Bouattia, and like Shaima, Dallali, who are two people who used to be the presidents of the NUS. Like, should we get into that? Yeah.
I would like to hear what happened to Malia Bouattia.
So I think the story of Malia Bouattia is really important to the history of the student movement. And I think the story of Malia is actually the story of like how the strength and the power of the student movement in Britain was attacked so viciously by the establishment in this country. So
what do you mean by the establishment of this country? Sorry for interrupting.
No, that's okay. I mean, like the media, the government, and the university administrations, and like the police, like the institutions that uphold like the status quo and the conditions that allow the UK to continue to, you know, provide diplomatic cover for Israel, to provide the Israeli army with surveillance flights, as we saw like over the months of this genocide.
And you put the universities in the same category?
Yeah, I would put the university administration in the same category as the establishment, because, you know, university administrations meet with the government regularly. And I'm sure they're probably having meetings right now scared of what's going to happen because of the student movement getting mobilized again around Gaza. And so we need to understand them as like even when students enter into negotiations with them, we need to understand them not as people that can be reasoned with. What they're interested in is maintaining the university as a neoliberal institution that is providing a consumer good to students, not actually a university that's interested in the space being truly a place of free education, free in every sense, not just like monetarily, but free in the sense that students can express their views, that can get organized, can demand things of their institutions. So that's what I mean when I say the establishment.
Thank you. Can we continue to what happened to Malia?
Yeah, so Malia was the president of NUS. She was democratically elected. And I started studying in 2017, so it was right after her election. And she was basically targeted by the Zionist lobby in Britain, and she was targeted by the Zionist institutions, but she was also targeted by the British government because she understood the power of the student movement when it was organized, and if the progressive parts of the student movement actually took power of the institutions, like the political vehicles in the student movement, so student unions, the National Union of Students, and that posed such a threat because not only did she believe in free education and like all of these like local demands, but also she understood the importance of international solidarity. And one of the main things on her ballot was solidarity with Palestine, was making sure that we could pass as many BDS resolutions as possible across the country in universities. And that really terrified the Israeli embassy, basically. It
terrified the Israeli embassy.
It terrified the Israeli embassy. It terrified the British establishment because the student movement historically, like if we look at, you know, the anti-apartheid movement in Britain, if you look at like even mobilizations against the Iraq war, like in the early 2000s, like students have always been on the forefront of these mobilizations, and the student movement like can confront the university as part of like the establishment that makes war, that like participates in the genocide unfolding in Gaza. And so what happened after Maya was elected was that she was attacked so viciously, even from within parts of the institution of the NUS itself that wanted the NUS to play a more conservative role in the student movement. And she was also attacked by the government itself. The Home Office did a massive investigation report into her, and obviously the accusation was anti-Semitism. But the reason why I'm recounting all of this history is that actually, like, I was lucky because I caught the end of like that memory of the movement since 2008 around Palestine, around free education, and it's been like really lost in the last few years in Britain. And so and what happened is that the way that so like we were talking earlier about the British tactics of like repressing student organizing and student activism, and I said they would target an individual person, but that represses the whole society or like the entire campus. And we saw the exact same thing. So we saw individually targeting Malia in like a very malicious way, but we also saw in the years after that, like they started cutting the funding of the NUS. And so actually it like represents really well how imperialism works, because like you cut the funding of the NUS, but you also completely depoliticized it. And so the weakening of the student movement started with the privatization of the university. It started with the introduction of like surveillance programs like Prevent, that became mandated duties to every part of the public sector of society in Britain. But it also looked like targeting individual people for their political beliefs. And it's these three tactics coming together that represses the student movement so effectively. And so, you know, before in the early 2010s, there was like this massive wave of like pushing student unions, which are like, you know, the democratic bodies that represent the student body at every campus on every university, pushing them to become charities. So when you become a charity, your orientation becomes about achieving your charitable objectives. It's not actually about democratically representing the student body, being a political vehicle for students to like think about their position in the university, think about their position in society, organize themselves, make demands of free education, make demands of like divest from genocide. And so these structural factors are actually what oppresses the student movement in Britain so effectively. And at the same time, you then see like, so that happens, like I know the SOAS student union where I used to work, like it became a charity around 2012 or 2013. And then in 2015, you get the 2015 Counterterrorism and Security Act, which makes Prevent a duty and an obligation across like the entire public sector. And then you get like the SOAS student union is investigated for anti-Semitism in 2018 because of like statements that they've made. And so you get them, they're investigated now not only by the Charity Commission, because the Charity Commission is a public body that has to abide by Prevent. But why is the student union a charity in the first place, you know? And it's because the university has cut funding. And so you see like privatization, securitization, and then like the targeting through like, you know, Zionist tactics of like, you know, we'll investigate this person, we'll suspend this person, all of it coming together. And then it's like really difficult for students. And meanwhile, students are like gaining debt. Students, you also see a change in the composition of the student body. The education becomes like an elite good rather than like a public service that everyone should have access to. In 2015, there was like this massive student march that was organized, and the slogan was no barriers, no fees, no something. And it really like brought together like the different elements of the ways that the student movement was like repressed, you know, and what they were confronting. They understood themselves fighting for free education, but also fighting against the securitization of the university, fighting against like the depoliticization of student unions and like the NUS. And that's why Malia represented such a challenge, you know, to the entire establishment. And that's why we've seen the NUS be systematically defunded in the aftermath. And what happened to Shaima was kind of like Shaima Dallali, who was suspended like 2 years ago, like, and now is coming to the end of her term, being suspended. And actually today NUS settled with Shaima, or like Shaima settled the case with NUS. Like that was, you know, the final gasps of, you know, these repression tactics. Like she was basically removed as soon as she was elected, because they know like the British student movement has actually, you know, led the way in a lot of ways. Like BDS motions were being passed since the early like I think 2006 was maybe the first BDS motion that passed at SOAS. I think it was the first one in the country. And so you see how like this has been like a target for years.
Thank you. Tell me more about the Zionist lobby in the educational institutions at universities. Do we have a Zionist lobby who works to undermine the work of the Palestinian and the pro-Palestine movement in the UK or not? And are you terrified of this Zionist lobby?
No, I'm not scared, because I think like sometimes the way that the Zionist lobby gets described as like really conspiratorial, when actually like if you just understand like how it operates, like you understand that like we just need to like out-organize them. So like the way that like I was saying earlier, like the way they operate is that they just like feed off of like already like repressive things like in the education sector. So like the privatization of the university, the securitization of the university, and which like Zionist institutions, like it's not like figments of like, you know, it's not like a mystified lobby. It's like organizations that are dedicated to this, you know, that do this work. Like they all work together. And so NUS has been systematically defunded, like I was saying earlier. Like the way that like these the way that higher education has been privatized, it like completely like aligns with like what like, you know, anti-Semitism becomes like a useful accusation that is used to like silence any organizing around Palestine.
Does it bite anymore?
I don't think it's like effective anymore. I think it's become a bit of a joke, even though obviously like anti-Semitism is like a very serious like phenomenon in our society. And that's like the tragic, I guess, like nature of all of this as well, is that like serious issues then become like conflated with become weaponized to like silence like organizing that is actually advocating anti-racist principles on campus, that is actually trying to build student power on campus. And so that's how like that's why I think it's like not that scary, because like the solution to all of these problems always comes back to how do you build student power on campus. Obviously, like the usual vehicles that would have built student power on campus were student unions, and student unions have been systematically targeted. And so like now we're confronted with this like really big question of like what's next for the student movement. We need to be able to coordinate on a national level. We need to be able to like build student movements on each campus, but also bring them together. We haven't had a student conference in years in Britain. It used to happen multiple times a year before the pandemic, you know? And so like these are the questions confronting the student movement now. And I guess like in the United States, you have like institutions like the National Students for Justice in Palestine that play the coordinating role that NUS used to play, like I don't know, 8 years ago now, maybe, or like 6 years ago. And so it's also like, you know, the students haven't been in a privatized higher education sector for that long in this country either, compared to the US that's been privatized for a very long time. And so also like reorienting like it's a reflection of what's happened to also like the broader mass movement for like free education for Palestine as well. It's just a reflection, like the student movement is also always like a reflection of that.
Can I add something quickly?
Yes.
To that? Just, yeah, also like I think it's really important to politicize fragmentation of the student movement, because the student movement has been fragmented, and Yasmin like explained a lot of the reasons why that is, and like why it was like orchestrated to be that way. But I also think it's important to historicize it as well, because like fragmentation is what the Zionist project has aimed to do to Palestinians, and that is reflected in the wider movement, in the diaspora and in exile. So even within the student movement, like for example, like after Oslo, like Oslo was a process which intended to fragment Palestinians further from each other, like geographically, like it split up into different areas, and that made Palestinians like separate from each other physically, like on the ground. Okay, but that's also a reflection of like what was also happening in exile as well. So if we can't be near each other geographically, then there's also social fragmentation that's taking place, but we can't really talk to each other. If there's social fragmentation taking place, then there's political fragmentation taking place, because we can't talk to each other to get organized. We can't actually we can't organize together. We can't plan and confront Zionism as sharply as we once were able to do. And what Oslo actually did as well in the student movement is it basically like kind of caused or like led up to the dissolution of GUPS, the General Union of Palestinian Students, which was actually the core to the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And like yeah, that actually is like why we're seeing kind of like a rebuilding of SJPs or Palestine societies and all of these different groups. And that's why we're kind of seeing fragments. But like, it's really important to also situate that historically, because that is also what the Zionists have intended to do to us. And also because they recognize how powerful students can be. Like, they know that we also need to be fragmented because of the role that we've played in confronting Zionism historically. And like, yeah, I think if we're going to talk about fear, like Zionists fear students who are organized. So what we're seeing today with the encampments is actually like a reunification of the student movement, and not because of the tactics, not because they're all doing encampments, but because the message is the same and the message is unified. So like, we're actually seeing like a building of political consciousness like across the student movement, and like who recognize the role of their universities. And this is like the way that we're understanding unity within the student movement as well.
For how long are you planning to camp at universities?
Students are willing to stay as long as possible. As long as possible. I mean, a student yesterday said indefinitely. And the point of this is to achieve the demands and to continue mounting pressure on the university administration, but also like on government administration as well. Like, they also recognize that students are kind of like unleashing an uprising, you know, like this is what's happening globally. And I said at the beginning, like there's over 142 encampments and counting globally across all continents. And that's something that like we actually haven't seen in a really long time. And it's actually going to be something that it's a historical moment. We're going to read about this in textbooks. Like, this is going to be something that we look back like for decades to come.
Because we're now reading about
Exactly.
the student protests for South Africa and the anti-apartheid of South Africa and the war in Vietnam.
Exactly.
So are you inspired by these movements that happened in the past?
Yeah, for sure. And I think students are actually using these encampments to learn more about that history. Like, we also have seen students, you know, organize teach-ins, organize workshops, and actually use the space to develop their own understandings of other historical student movements that have advanced their political goals and have kind of like developed a vision for what liberation actually means. And it actually starts on campus a lot of the time.
For example, like during the intense like years of anti-apartheid organizing in London, there was a really famous occupation that happened at LSE, and there was like a really famous image of like the gates to LSE shut down with like a banner in front that says this building is like occupied until like apartheid falls, or something along these lines. And I think students here are entering the encampments in the same sentiment, like we're here until Palestine is free. Like it's 100 years too long, but also I think it's again like the logical conclusion of students who have been organizing for months and haven't seen a response from the university, and so they have to escalate as well.
Let me ask you, now after 7 months of this genocide, after 7 months of protesting and mobilizing and advocacy and all of this work and the hundreds of thousands of protesters who go to the streets every week, and now the student protests and all of this work, and still the West still supports Israel with weapons, with arms, with diplomatic cover, with the media. My question to you, and I keep asking others the same question. Do we actually live in democracy in the West? Is this a democracy?
I think that what the national protests and the regular frequent demos have been doing is actually showing that the real power lies in the streets, not necessarily in the polls. Like, we live in a two-party system, and that's not like democratic for a lot of people, obviously. And like, I think that what the demos have done is actually shift public opinion. And like, without the demos, like, people have been growing consciousness because of turning up to the streets and understanding and like keeping like their finger on the pulse and understanding what's happening on the ground and like really understanding these developments. And I feel like this is what is actually shifting public opinion. And like,
does public opinion matter?
Yeah, I think it does matter because like you need to build a mass base of people who are able to continue to confront Zionism again from wherever they.
Does it matter?
Does it matter? Yeah, it does.
But also like it.
Let me just please.
Yeah.
I need to hear more from you. Why does it matter? Because right now, the public opinion, I can say the public opinion is with Palestine.
Yeah.
But still the war continues, the genocide continues, the government still supports Israel with the weapon.
Yeah.
So what are we doing?
I actually think we can even bring this back to the student movement, because what student movement is doing is actually exposing the logic. So like students are exposing, for example, how their universities are implicated in Zionism and imperialism by looking at how it manifests in their institutions. And this is what we're seeing multiple different sectors in this society doing as well. Like you've got parents and families who are exposing, like in their daily grocery shops, like what products, for example, need to be boycotted and why, how they're implicated in the Zionist project, for example. And then you're seeing academics also do the same in their institutions. You're seeing youth groups do the same. You're seeing multiple different sectors. And like, for example, there are other formations that have grown, for example, like healthcare workers, cultural workers. There's various different sectors that have actually looked into how Zionism manifests and shows up in their sectors. Teachers too, like there's.
Yet the genocide continues.
Yeah, and I think that there's also sometimes a sentiment that like we can't control what the Zionist war machine does. But like I also think that the Zionist war machine will fall because it's predicated on a logic that is baseless, and as long as we continue to expose that logic, it won't be able to sustain itself, if that makes sense. Do you want to explain it better?
No, you explained it really well. Sorry, I don't mean to.
No, I don't think I know what I'm saying. Like I think that like I said at the beginning, Zionism is a global phenomenon and it shows up everywhere, and different groups are looking at where it's showing up in their daily lives, and they're disrupting that. They're learning more about it and they're exposing the logic, which just doesn't stand. It's baseless, and that's how Zionism will also fall.
Yeah, I think that one of the most important like developments since October 7th is that actually the British public is being confronted with the fact that like the British ruling class don't listen to them, and it's never been clearer. And that's exactly what you were getting at. Like that's that exposure, that tear in like, you know, like the status quo is like there's no coming back from it. And I think the fact that like, you know, hundreds of thousands of people mobilize on a weekly basis, and that is completely ignored, and not just ignored, it's minimized. It's like intentionally minimized by the government, is making people like realize that this doesn't end with Palestine. Like the government doesn't listen to us on free education for the student movement, doesn't listen to us on like housing, it doesn't listen to us about food security, and it's about tying all of these together. That's how we're actually going to build like a strong movement. And I think that's what we're seeing happening. Like what I'm seeing is that like the London Renters Union is showing up to like shut down the Department of Business and Trade, you know, last week, because that same department is that's where like the contracts for weapons manufacturers are done. But it's also these are the same institutions that like block social housing from like being developed like in a true like democratic and sustainable way for our society. So it's also about like making Palestine a local struggle and making local struggles international struggles, because actually for years like in our organizing we used to always identify the Grenfell fire as like a really important like site of imperialism. Like that is here in this city, people were killed by the same logics that people in Gaza are killed by. It's a very different scale. It's like in Gaza, you're like at the sharpest confrontation with this violence, because there is no space for you to live. There is no space for you to exist under Zionism. But here, it's a different kind of manifestation of it. But it's the same struggle. Like we need to be united across all these scales.
Let's end with some messages that I would like you to send to the students in the UK and all across the world, to university administrations and to the government. What would you say to them?
I have total faith that the students will prevail. I think that the government is intending to intimidate students, and they just won't win because students have been tireless for the last 7 months. We're in the 7th month of the genocide now, and we kept thinking each month, like, will we be able to sustain these mobilizations? Will students burn out? Will the organizing just end? And it just hasn't, because students are motivated by the steadfastness of the people of Gaza, and this is what they're centering in all of what they do. And I think that that's something that's going to continue. And for as long as the Zionist project's violence continues, the resistance of the students will continue. And I really believe in that. And I think that no matter the attempts that the government and the university administrations attempt to confine and attempt to prevent students from continuing this, it just won't work. And I think that students will win.
Yeah, basically exactly the same, because this is a moment where we're witnessing like the reunification of the student movement. This is a moment where actually students are coordinating on a national level about Palestine, and it hasn't happened in years. And we have like more experience now over all these years, and we're going to be funneling that into strengthening the student movement. But also because as long as the genocide continues and as long as Palestine is not free, we won't rest, because it's our moral duty and responsibility, and that's the commitment we make. And that's what a lot of British students recognize, is that we have a responsibility and a duty to say, not in our name. The institutional complicity has to end, and the British government will eventually have to listen. And it's not because, of the negotiations, it's not because of the conversation with the administration, it's because the power of the movement as a whole is going to also strengthen the student movement, and the student movement also leads the way towards that.
Yasmin and Yara, thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much, Ahmed.